Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Hanna Love. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Transformative Placemaking and Center for Community Uplift. And I am so excited to be kicking off this event that is highlighting new Brookings research on the causes of the 2020 homicide spike and the evidence-based solutions that we can all employ to prevent future spikes in violent crime in the years to come. This research is so important because, as many of us are far too familiar with, the United States has long had an epidemic of gun violence. So, the United States has the highest gun homicide rate among its peer large and high income countries, and firearms are the leading cause of death for young people nationwide. But like many of the issues that we face in our nation, the COVID-19 pandemic put this long-standing epidemic into a new territory. So in 2020, the United States saw the single largest increase in murders since the FBI began tracking national murder rates in 1960, with an increase that was nearly 30% driven by primarily gun homicides. What many of the debates around the spike in gun homicides have overlooked, however, is that focusing even on nationwide trends or citywide trends can obscure key pieces of evidence that are crucial for reducing gun violence. Most notably, the burden of gun violence is not shared equally within cities and regions, nor has it ever been. There is a long-standing relationship between gun violence and place within the United States that is often overlooked by both key stakeholders in the criminal justice realm and the economic development realm. Within cities and non-urban settings, gun violence disproportionately concentrates within a select set of neighborhoods and hyper-local areas where other indicators of structural disadvantage like poverty and unemployment also tend to cluster. Given this strong body of evidence, knowing how to craft effective homicide reduction policies requires pivoting from solely criminal justice focused solutions towards structural solutions that target the neighborhood-based conditions that create and sustain crime, and involve a broader section of actors outside of the criminal justice space. So this new research that we will be discussing today from Brookings will build upon this foundational evidence and take it one step further, really demonstrating how the intersection between employment, education, and other indicators of neighborhood well-being have fueled the recent uptick in murders, as well as examining how we can avoid other sorts of spikes in violent crime in the future. What I love about this report that we will be talking about is that the authors offer targeted, actionable solutions on how cities and neighborhoods can prepare now for the next inevitable shock in employment and education that could fuel a future crisis in gun homicides. So that we're really going to focus on actionable solutions for how we can avoid future spikes. So to help us understand this important topic, we have an amazing set of researchers, practitioners, city leaders, and funders who are going to discuss how intentional efforts to support young men and boys in accessing quality education and employment can advance broader community safety and well-being outcomes. So without further ado, I will pass off this mic to the lead authors of the report, Rhett Morris and Rohit Acharya, who are both founding partners at Common Good Labs and non-resident senior fellows at Brookings Metro. So I will pass it off to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Uh, uh, as Hannah mentioned, Rohit and I, in addition to being non-resident fellows at Brookings, are also partners at Common Good Labs. Common Good Labs, just so all of you know, is an organization made up of data scientists, researchers, designers that works to find new solutions to the problems that face local communities across the country. Today, we're looking at the issue of gun violence, which, as Hannah mentioned, has been a problem that's grown increasingly worse and then has seen some positive changes in recent years. During 2020, the United States experienced the most rapid surge that's been recorded in homicides, where homicides in a single year increased by almost 30%. And we see that this increase in homicides was seen in large and medium-sized cities all over the country, um, and as well as rural areas. What's interesting is that this spike in homicide continued for several years into 2021, 2022, and partially through 2023, and then rapidly fell in late 2023, and then last year fell almost as quickly as it initially increased. And so one of the questions that came out of kind of this experience that the people have had is, why did this occur? Why did murders begin to spike so rapidly in 2020? Some of the initial hypotheses that people began discussing at the beginning of this surge were mostly focused on things related to protests and the events around the killing of George Floyd in late May 2020, or on efforts to kind of understand, was there some sort of police pullback in the summer of 2020 that kind of was related to this increase in violence? As time has passed on, what we see is that many of these initial explanations don't seem to be as convincing in terms of how much of the data they can explain as maybe they initially seemed. And so we can look at some new data that's come out in recent years to kind of get a sense of what we see. And so here, what we have is a chart that shows us the weekly number of homicides in the United States in 2020, as well as 2019. So 2020 is this red line here, and 2019 is here in gray. And so what we can see is that there is an increase in murders that begins in actually mid-April of 2020. And so that increase goes up by about 17 murders per week on average for about 6 weeks. And then here we can see this line here represents when George Floyd was killed, the week of Memorial Day 2020. And so what we can see is following that event, the murder rate continues to increase, but increases at a relatively similar rate with some slight additional kind of bump. But we can see that the trend in increases in murder really begins well before Floyd was killed. And so if we look a little bit further back to understand what was going on in 2020, what was happening in mid-April, one of the things that we see is cell phone data shows us that between the beginning of the pandemic in kind of early March of 2020 up until mid-April, people started spending a lot more time at home due to sheltering in place orders, due to just the fact that many people were initially extremely concerned about catching the virus. And so the amount of time people spend out in public, out in the community, declines dramatically. But in mid-April, the weather starts to get a little bit warmer, and in the places where most people live in the United States, in the major population centers. And what we see is cell phone data shows us that people start to go outside their homes more often. And we know from existing research on homicide that most homicides don't happen inside of homes, but rather happen outside in the community. Most people who commit homicide tend to be the people who they commit homicide against tend to be people that are acquaintances or people that they don't know very well. It's less common for people to commit homicide against people who are in their immediate families or people that they share a home with. So as people start to go out in public more, what do we see in mid-April? Well, we start to see the homicide rate rapidly increasing, again, by 17 murders per week on average. And then we see a little bit of an additional increase after Floyd is killed, but more or less building on that trend rather than starting the trend. And we continue to see, again, though the protests lasted only for about 6 weeks in the United States, the increase in homicide continued on for about 3 years, so 150 weeks. And so we wanted to understand, okay, what could have caused murders to begin to spike in kind of mid-April of 2020? And for that, we looked to some existing research. And so existing research tells us a number of things. The first thing that we can see from existing research is that, uh, as Hannah mentioned, violence tends to be concentrated in specific places within cities. And those places have something in common that we can see relatively easily in the data, and that's that they have persistingly high levels of concentrated poverty. And so if you look across cities in the United States, on average, about 20% of people in cities in the US live in neighborhoods that have really high rates of poverty consistently over time. But those neighborhoods are responsible for around half of the homicides that occur in their communities. In addition to being found in specific places, research also tells us that homicides tend to be committed by specific people. And so we see that teen boys and young men in their 20s commit a disproportionately high share of homicides. But even among that group, most teen boys and young men are not violent. But we see that those who share some specific characteristics become much more likely to engage in violence. And those characteristics are when teen boys drop out of school, when they don't complete high school, and when young men become disconnected from work. And so we see that homicides are committed in specific places and by people who share specific characteristics, specifically teen boys and young men who are disconnected from school, who are disconnected from work traditionally. And so when we have cities that have large numbers of these places where homicides are more likely to occur, as well as larger numbers of the people who are more likely to commit homicide, we see that oftentimes they tend to have higher rates of homicide and other violent crimes. And so we can look at murders and how they spiked in a single city as a case study to get a sense of how this plays out in an individual city. So this is Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Baton Rouge is one of the most violent cities in the United States in recent years. It's had anywhere between 4 to 8 times more murders each year than the rest of the country. And one of the things we see in Baton Rouge that's really interesting is that the pattern of where we would expect to see homicides based on existing research and who would be kind of more likely to commit them can be visualized using data from the community. And so if we want to understand why Baton Rouge has such a challenge with violence and homicide, we can look to see, well, first of all, the city has a very large number of neighborhoods with concentrated poverty, as you can see represented here in this map in black. In addition to that, we can see that many young men in these neighborhoods are disconnected from school and disconnected from work and have been over the past 5 to 10 years. And if we look at where homicides have occurred over the last, say, 5 years, we can see that it's very connected. There's a really high spatial correlation here between where murders are occurring in the city and where we see really high rates of concentrated poverty within neighborhoods, as well as large numbers of teen boys and young men disconnected from school, disconnected from work. We can actually look at data in Baton Rouge and see that before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were 2 separate spikes in homicide. So what we can see here is the first homicide occurred in 2005. And what we can see in 2005 is that to 2006, Hurricane Katrina struck South Louisiana. And what that did was it pushed large numbers of teen boys out of the school system and caused a multi-year spike in dropouts in Baton Rouge. It also increased the number of unemployed men. Many men who were displaced from low-income neighborhoods in New Orleans ended up moving into Baton Rouge and typically moved into lower-income neighborhoods in the city. And so there was this massive shock where boys were pushed out of school, young men in the community were a much greater number of them were unemployed. And what do we see happening over the next year? Well, we see a spike in homicides, an increase of about 30% inside of Baton Rouge. And as you can see, it took about a decade for the homicide rate in the community to kind of end up getting back to a similar place to where it was in 2005. Unfortunately, in 2017, the city experienced another challenge. What we see is that there was a massive flood where schools were closed for 3 weeks that pushed hundreds of teen boys out of school in low-income neighborhoods. And what happened immediately afterwards? Well, again, homicides spiked in Baton Rouge. They went up, in this case, by 50%. within a single year and continued to remain elevated in 2018 and 2019 going into the 2020 pandemic. And so what we can see in this example in Baton Rouge is when we have events, shocks that push large numbers of teen boys out of school and young men out of work, they tend to be followed by spikes in homicide inside the community. And so now I'm going to pass to my colleague Rohit, who's going to look at how some of the same lessons can be applied to understand the spike in homicides that occurred across the country in 2020. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Rhett. So now let's shift from city-specific examples to a broader explanation of the spike in homicides in 2020. Two key phenomena occurred during that year that are similar to what we see in the case study from Baton Rouge. First, in March 2020, large numbers of teenage boys in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty were pushed out of school. Around the same time, many young men in these neighborhoods also lost their jobs. Based on the formula for local violence that we discussed earlier, we would expect to see that cities where more teenage boys and young men were pushed out of school and work in low-income neighborhoods would experience larger increases in homicides. And sure enough, this is exactly what we observe. Cities that faced larger disruptions amongst young men in March and April 2020 experienced sharper spikes in their homicide rates in the following months. This also helps explain why homicide rates began to decline in 2023 as schools fully reopened and employment levels approached pre-pandemic norms. With this context in mind, we now turn to what civic leaders can do to prevent future spikes in violence and reduce current levels of homicide. First, it's important to understand a unique factor that amplifies violence in the United States, and that's the prevalence of guns. The majority of murders in this country are committed with firearms. Furthermore, almost all the increase in homicides during 2020 was due to gun-related murders, as we can see here. When we compare the US to other countries, the proportion of murders committed with guns is significantly higher here than elsewhere. This disparity explains why we didn't see the same spike in homicide rates in other nations during this period. However, given the high rates of gun ownership and usage in the United States, the risk of gun violence is unlikely to disappear entirely from American cities. So what can be done? Civic leaders are employing several strategies to reduce violence. First, they are providing broad improvements to general conditions that influence crime. This includes expanding access to mental health care, strengthening community building organizations, improving street lighting, and addressing environmental factors such as removing abandoned buildings. They're also enhancing criminal justice practices. This involves directing more resources to solving crimes, improving police practices, and building trust between law enforcement and communities. Finally, they are re-engaging with individuals already involved with violence. Programs like READY in Chicago identify young men involved in or at high risk of violence and connect them to services such as therapy, education, and job opportunities. We believe that there should be a fourth strategy, which is the prevention of violence involvement among specific children and teens at greatest risk. Recent efforts have reconnected teens to school and work, building on prior successes like rising high school graduation and employment rates. Civic leaders can reduce violence by focusing on three objectives. First, identify boys at risk of dropping out and becoming involved in violence before they fall behind their peers. Disengagement starts early, sometimes years before high school, with signs like absences, behavioral issues, and low test scores. Leaders can target at-risk children in high poverty areas with extra support to keep them in school. Second, ensure that the boys at greatest risk actually receive the support they need. Effective programs like tutoring, mentoring, and counseling can keep kids on track, but they're often not available or don't reach those who need them most. These programs are cost-effective and compared not only to the societal costs of violence, but interventions done in early education are orders of magnitude cheaper than those done in teenage or adult years. In short, early investments pay off. Finally, continually measure the results of prevention programs to understand which combinations of support are most effective. High-risk children often need multiple interventions. Data can pinpoint effective program combinations and track performance to ensure continuous improvement. Without this, even well-designed efforts can fail over time. So in conclusion, a comprehensive approach addressing both the broad social conditions and the specific individuals at risk is essential for reducing violence and preventing future spikes in homicides. And with that, I'd like to pass the baton to Andre Perry, who's a senior fellow and director of the Center of Community Uplift at Brookings. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, Black Power Scorecard. And so it's my honor to pass it over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Rohit. I know we're going to remove the slide and get into a wonderful conversation. By the way, I want everyone to download the report, Why Did U.S. Homicides Spike in 2020 and then Decline Rapidly in 2023, 2024. This wonderful report, I encourage everyone to read it. But it's my honor to present to you a wonderful panel that's actually dealing with these issues on the day today. First up to bat, I would like to introduce the illustrious mayor of Baltimore, Brandon Scott, who's doing this work every single day of the year. Next is Chris Meyer, who's the president and CEO of Baton Rouge Area Foundation, a community foundation based in Louisiana, and Denise Villamil, who is the executive director of Southern California Crossroads, violence prevention organization. I want to jump right into this narrative because much of the data that we've heard and seen is actually somewhat an optimistic vision for me, because we see that neighborhood conditions and even policies have an impact on violence. But the overarching narrative is that violence is caused by individual flaws, by character flaws. I'm going to start with you, Mayor Scott, on this question. How do you use data and facts to shift narratives that are over-indexed in moral flaws and character flaws?
Well, I think that, well, listen, thank you for the question, Andre. For me, growing up here in Baltimore, young, poor, and Black, I understand wholeheartedly how it is to be thought of as someone that's inherently criminal and violent, right? And I know that that was never the case for me. And growing up and being here in City Hall since I was 23, I've had a front row seat for many years at failed policies and practices on how to deal with this disease of gun violence. And when now, for me, we have to use data in every sense, right? Because never was it the case that everybody that looked like me in my neighborhood was a violent person, right? It was always a small group of people. And what you have to do, or if my grandmother would say, if she was still here, now that we know better, we have to do better, right? We have to focus in on those very people who are at the highest risk of being the victim or the perpetrator of that violence, and figure out what's going on with them. First, offering them an opportunity to change their life, whether they need further education, job training, better housing, relocation, and giving them that opportunity, which we do through our flagship violence reduction initiative, which is our group violence reduction strategy, and do just that. And if they do not take us up on those opportunities to change their life, then that's when our law enforcement partners and when we bring them in to remove those folks. Data drives everything that we do, but I want to be I always caution folks from just thinking about data and its numbers, because they're also people, and you have to understand the conditions of a neighborhood, the history of a neighborhood, the history of a city. And for me, growing up here in Baltimore, the birthplace of redlining, where the first redlining law was ironically signed in the room that I'm talking to you guys from right now, we have to understand how all of those years of inequitable policies plays into that. The reality that, as we heard, that most of this happens with guns, and over 60% of the guns that my police department recovers on the streets of Baltimore comes from out of state. We recovered 2,500 guns just last year and 2,500 the year before. All of these things are a system, and we have to look at that data as a part of a system and understand that you only address a disease by talking about every single symptom, not just one, with not just one solution.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Chris in on this conversation because as a community foundation, you have to invest in many different programs and entities. Also, you got to ask donors to give, and the donors themselves believe in sort of the moral reasons or moral failings of people for crime. So, how do you use data to influence stakeholders in Baton Rouge?
Yeah, and thanks, Andre, for this opportunity. I mean, we saw very similarly a wide range of views on what's the cause of the problem, what are the solution sets, but really they weren't grounded in what's the reality, how did we get here, what's the formula driving violence in Baton Rouge. And so our partnership with the team from Common Good Labs was really novel for us because it allowed us to bring the entire community together, from political leadership to business leadership, philanthropic community leaders, and actually talk in facts about what was driving this. And seeing that slide that demonstrated in our own context when we realized spikes in violent crime in Baton Rouge, it became really obvious that it was about the disconnect. And if we wanted to be part of a solution, instead of sort of spreading our resources thin across the board, this really gave us new insights in where we needed to target those supports. That this really, for us, became a math problem. We had too many young men who are disconnected right now from the path to opportunity, and we really wanted to focus our leaders on that. So it gives us kind of a framework to really ground people in. If you want to make a difference, this is where you can spend your resources. If you want to make a political point, well, then we can continue with the same challenge. And so really, we've been galvanizing people together to solve the problem, which for us is now leading to a loss of population. And we've seen no city in America with more than 30 homicides per 100,000 really be a thriving city. And so we want to be one of those communities like Baltimore that's beginning to turn the tide and really see an improvement in its violent crime rate.
You know, Denise, I talked about data and how it's been used, and you've heard how a mayor and a community foundation have used data to influence the broader public and those who are influencing those systems that predict for crime. But I want to talk to you about, how do you use data with individuals who are in communities, or who even may commit crimes? Do you use data like this to talk about the issue of crime?
I think we definitely get creative in our use of data when it comes to engaging individuals when it comes to services, but sort of even just taking a scale back. Obviously, we're 100% government funded. A few dollars here and there from foundations, which makes it really hard. But if we did not have data or understood it, we would not be doing the services that we do. So definitely, at the forefront of the work that we do, we have to have sort of those metrics to show that the services and strategies we're using are working. So one, they help tell the story, they create that partnership with government and our funders. But definitely it looks different when it comes to engaging individuals when one-on-one. So for example, like if it's a youth, we're engaging a client in the hospital, we're not necessarily giving them numbers like, oh, this is our annual report, this is what we did last year. It's going to look more organic. It's going to look more relationship building and letting them know very clear the resources that we can do. But in order to be successful and implement some of our programs, we do definitely use that data to get into more hospitals, to service more schools, talking to administrators, sharing our success stories. So it does help build our narrative. And whenever possible, we do get creative and share that with our families and clients that we serve, but definitely more beneficial when it comes to receiving more funding and continuing the work that we do.
I'm going to stick with you because you're on the West Coast, you're near LA. Um, uh, what do you do in this period of time where kids are going to be out of school, and there will be disruptions? Can you get ahead of this in any way?
Yeah, so we're actually in a very unique time again in Los Angeles. If you've been following the news, we're experiencing wildfires, a lot of families being evacuated. I'll be honest, the first response was probably a trauma response from having experienced a pandemic. And you'll probably see that right now in the news. Everyone is flooding with wanting to support. It's with clothing, with supplies, with food. But I think we've reached the max of what we could take in certain areas when it comes to clothing and resources. Now, we as an organization, my first thought was the youth that have been displaced. If you are familiar with the LA County area, these areas could have a reputation of being sort of like, oh, they're by the hills, they're wealthier people, it's Palisades by the west side. But there are a lot of youth who would go out to these schools from inner cities. A lot of the families who do gardening, landscaping, house cleaning, the food service industry that come from our neighborhoods and communities are now without jobs. So it really is an issue that is hitting home in various different arenas, and specifically for youth related. With the school shutdowns, even though some of the schools weren't in proximity of the fires, they did get impacted by air quality. The teachers who lived in these areas were impacted, some lost homes, so it did cause a big disruption. Last week, schools were closed, the majority of the largest district, Los Angeles School District, local school districts. Now they're reopening. So we're not going to see like that immediate pandemic remote learning, but we still did open up a resource hub that's going to be open, for the next few months, where we have our case manager supporting to complete FEMA applications, a safe space for youth, because there were youth homes as well in those areas that did burn down. So we're trying to troubleshoot and address that, but also be mindful that it's not the pandemic, that this isn't going to be the similar situation. But we are ready. We have been engaging youth and rolling out a few initiatives to support families.
Now, one of the things I always say, and I mean this, that we're not going to nonprofit our way out of these problems. At some point, we need investments, big investments from government and from corporations to change neighborhood conditions, and to shift policy. I'm going to go to Mayor Scott on this. When we talk about investments, when we talk about violence, the word investments rarely comes up. But as mayor, I mean, what a large part of what you do is provide revenue to organizations, which in a form of an investment. How do you invest in Baltimore and the residents of Baltimore in ways that specifically reduces crime?
Well, I think for us, we look at, again, we way back in 2021, I unveiled Baltimore's first ever comprehensive violence reduction plan, no longer putting the full burden of reducing violence on the backs of our women and men in our police department, because it was never their sole responsibility. So once you have a comprehensive approach, that requires comprehensive investment, right? You can't just say this, you have to actually do it. So for us, obviously, we're in a federal consent decree for our police department. We were one of the few cities that didn't have a spike in 2020 because many of the things that happened with George Floyd and that murder happened in Baltimore with the death of Freddie Gray many years before. But coming out of that, I thought that it was very important for us to grow the ecosystem that we're dealing with violence reduction. So I took 50 million of my American Rescue Plan dollars and put that into our community violence intervention ecosystem.
Repeat that number. What was that?
50 million of our American Rescue, 50 million of our $641 million in American Rescue funding went to our community violence intervention ecosystem. That allowed us to grow that ecosystem, where we already were a city for many years that had violence interrupters through our Safe Streets program, but we were able to help that grow. We grew to having hospital-based violence responders, because where does everyone that gets shot go? They go to the hospital. It's the very exact place you should have people that can diffuse those incidents. We grew our victim services, where in Baltimore, until I became mayor, in a city that has been plagued with gun violence longer than I've been on this planet, gunshot victims were not offered victim services, right? How crazy was that? When you look at the work that we're now investing in community organizations like the Brothers of We Are Us, who are out there doing that work, Challenge to Change, who works with our young people, Tendea Family, investing in school-based violence reduction work that we're doing with organizations focused there. Obviously, our group violence reduction strategy, which requires us to invest in community moral force partners and organizations who go out and talk to these young men and women about changing their life. And then we have to have programs and training for them. All of that requires investment. And that's the way that we're going to continue to operate in here. And that's, of course, on top of, Andre, the work that we're doing in city government differently now, how we're working specifically to reduce the vacant housing crisis in Baltimore. We have a $3 billion with a B dollar plan to deal with that. We've been able to go from having 16,000 vacant properties in the city for 20 years to, in just that 4-year period of my first term, having that go to 13,000. How we're investing in those neighborhoods through building new recreation centers. And we opened 11 new or renovated schools in my first term. We opened 5 new rec centers in those very neighborhoods. Those are the kind of approaches that we're having that goes beyond the daily work of the women and men in BPD, of the women and men that do violence intervention work. The entirety of city government is now invested in an equitable way into the places that were forgotten and disinvested in on purpose.
You know, Chris, what I just heard, it's interesting that much of these crime and violence reduction strategies can be described as just good community development, strengthening communities overall. You have limited resources, and how I see the power of community foundations is that they can invest in organizations and strategies that are demonstrations of sorts that mayors and governors and presidents can then invest in and scale. What kind of organizations do you invest in Baton Rouge specifically to be a demonstration of sorts for mayors and governors?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that's exactly the role of community foundations, is to really be catalytic, to be sort of that standard bearer that across, especially administrations. I mean, what we saw in Baton Rouge, for example, we had a very successful violence interruption program in place in a previous mayoral term. When that changed about 8 years ago, we saw that program eliminated because it wasn't kind of the flavor of that potential political leader. And so we as communities have to find that partnership where a community foundation can really, we outlast administrations. We are permanent institutions. And I think when the mayor just described kind of building that ecosystem, that's exactly how we think about that. So, you know, we approached that after we sort of saw this sort of illuminating data around how the shocks were creating more disengaged youth that really could be fuel, unfortunately, for a violence challenge. We really then thought about how do you build a wide coalition of government, business, private sector, community folks. We built that through a coalition called Safe BR. A lot of cities have done that, and that's the great thing of this, is we can look to other cities that have then figured out, well, who are your violence interrupters? Who are your youth building organizations? We've been working on a project, in fact, in the area of our city that has the highest number of shootings. And really, there is no activity center. There's no place to go after school. And so we've worked with the Boys and Girls Club, the Law Enforcement Criminal Justice Foundation, to develop an inspiration center that really will, it's modeled after success we've seen in programs in Atlanta that really bring law enforcement community partners together with youth to give them something to do out of school time, after school time, and integrate that with the schools as well, so those principals know where their students are going. I mean, this is the kind of work that you have to break down. And I think we see our role as really a convener, a facilitator, and putting in some of that catalytic capital to keep people focused on what will it take for our community to cut our murder rate in half. And it's going to take a mix of investment from different partners and staying true to that goal and that kind of approach, so that we don't just change course every political administration.
I'm going to go back to Mayor Scott real quick, because this is also just a workforce issue that there's only so many interventions and interruptions you're going to do if the larger workforce is not working for and let's be clear, low income in often cases Black residents. Then this is going to be hard. So how do you get these economic development actors to invest in the neighborhoods and the people who experience violent crime?
Well, I think that really starts with leadership, right? This is the third time that Baltimore has tried like a group violence reduction strategy, and this is the most success that we've had, because you really need that executive buy-in. Because yes, this is funded with federal dollars, with state dollars, with city dollars, but it's also funded here with philanthropic dollars, because we have a united front that we go to those folks and say, this is the strategy and the plan. We've shown you. We started with the most violent district. We piloted there. We've shown you proof of concept. And much like they do, and this is a tough conversation many times for business. I mean, not for business, but for political folks, right? And we're showing you that we have a plan to do this and grow this responsibly over time, not overselling it and telling everyone in every part of the city, every elected official that, hey, we're going to start this program, and after the pilot, everyone's going to have it immediately. No, we are now growing it slowly across the city responsibly, because like you just said, Andre, you're talking about stuff that requires a particular set of people with a particular set of skills, much like Liam Nielsen and Taken, right? You just don't find these folks anywhere. And you have to be very careful about growing something like this so fast. It's just like a business. If a business grows too fast, what we've seen it happen, businesses come, they spike, they're hot, and then they're gone, just like that. And this kind of work requires that, because you need those people that have those lived experiences, who used to be out there on those corners, who used to be the people shooting people, to be able to help deliver the message of change people, changing their life. And you have to make sure that you are getting the right people and doing it the right way. So delivering the message to our business folks, I think is the way you do that is you prove it to them and say, you have said for years that you want to invest in ways for us to reduce violence. In my case, they told me that was the only thing that I should be focused on when I first got into office, even though we had a raging pandemic, right? And we did that. And now it's about how we sustain it over time. And it's really telling people that, look, now we have it. Are you going to help us? Are you going to support something that has been proven to work? And for my government counterparts, is you can't just have that validated by you. We have our stuff is being validated by the University of Pennsylvania. So it's not just us saying it. We have academic research that is proving that this strategy is working. And then who can argue with that? And if they do, then you know these folks aren't truly invested in your community.
Now, Denise, you work for an organization that receives these investments, and you work in schools and hospitals. What does that actually look like in content when you receive this money? What does quality practice actually look like in the context of these institutions?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll even go back a little bit. So I used to work at the mayor's office for the city of Los Angeles, and I was on the funding side, funding intervention agencies, rolling out contracts, and now I'm on the nonprofit side. So a whole other world, a whole other, beast to sort of manage. And I would definitely say that what we've been doing and has been benefiting us has really been partnering with those foundations. We would not be able to have grown so much in the last few years, and the partnerships that are existing between government and foundations, like that should be the standard. If government is not gonna, there's bureaucracy and ways of doing things and contracting that is not gonna change overnight. There's, legalities and all that. But we've been able to be successful in rolling out different strategies and grants in partnership with foundations as third party and fiscal sponsors. And that has made a key difference in being able to hire quicker, roll out services, have cash flow. They provide advances, they provide capacity building, they share their resources, and we end up feeling like genuine partners. Not that certain government departments, because like I said, the funding ultimately is coming from government, but they definitely saw that they weren't going to be able to do it alone to roll out the American Rescue dollars. So we experienced a large growth during 2020 till now. It's slowed down right now, but we grew our agency about 3 times our budget due to the American Rescue funding. We would not have been able to do that without Foundation, as Foundation's being the third fiscal party. So I feel like that has to be the standard practice if government can't catch up as fast in giving us those advances or payouts, or the support for capacity building has been, key. So definitely something that we've navigated here in LA.
I'm going to stick with you, but I'm going to ask the same question to the mayor and Chris. This is hard work. I've never been in a Black or brown community that did not want safety. You have grandmothers, you have relatives, like literally screaming, "What are you doing?" Can you just share a little bit about the qualitative aspect of this work, the personal aspect of this work, because it is hard. You are working in times with people with limited opportunity, limited outlook, low education, and it's just hard. So can you just share some stories and some nuances that relay how difficult this work is?
Yeah, definitely. It is very heavy. The work that we do is unique. It's gonna draw, as Mayor said, lived experience folks who are still in the community, who are maybe they are no longer in certain lifestyles, but they have certain connections and they're at the front line of the violence that is happening in the community. And these are our staff. So when something happens in the community, it's not someone that drives home, a few cities away and they get to be removed. And that's the same for myself. I live in the communities that we're serving. So when we talk about it being hard work, it's very personal. So anything that we roll out or show up to the offices to implement in the schools, some of us attended these schools. Our family members are in those schools, so one, it's very personal. So that already coming in the door, it's going to be personal, it's going to be heavy and hard. We do have a lot of self-care, a lot of trauma-informed practices that we try to manage and balance the work that we do. But when it comes to higher lived experience community intervention workers, we come in knowing that it's going to be heavy work. So right now we're experiencing the wildfires, but post-pandemic, a lot of the things that we talked about, youth being displaced, youth not having homes, sorry, not homes, caretakers. So we lost grandmas during the pandemic. We lost folks that we weren't really thinking were the caretakers until, unfortunately, we know that, but they were gone, and it was a large impact in our communities where a lot of these leaders and caretakers were no longer there. And so we've been dealing with a lot of the aftermath of youth who've been hurting, mental health issues, not really coming back anymore into the schools, but even in the communities, they're sort of stuck at home. Their social media was raising a lot of our youth, and they've kind of been stuck there. So we're still trying to get them out of the homes, come into programming, come into trades. Let's try to have you in some job placements. One of the things that I think really during the pandemic, even now, has been hard and we're navigating is we were dealing with 10 and 15-year-olds who were the age of joining gangs and engaging in risky behavior, violent behavior. That went down to, we've seen 7-year-olds, 6-year-olds committing really unbelievable acts of violence that I think are a direct result of having been exposed to something in the home while they were during stay-at-home orders, social media, youth that are already claiming gangs as young as 8-year-olds and already even being caught with weapons. So things like that I didn't see before, we're seeing now. The referral age really lowered. And that's something that's tough that we're navigating. And like I said, it's a balance of having to deal with, it's personal, it's at home, and it's just kind of been the nature of the work being in this field for a few years.
Mayor Scott, I follow your social media. I follow the news in Baltimore being in DC. You take this very personally. You know people, you know many of the victims and maybe the perpetrators, and this has to be personal. And so what I've admired about you, that you keep your eye on the prize with every win and loss. You know, that you don't necessarily collapse if there's a murder in a neighborhood and you give up this effort. And likewise, with the gains, you don't get too high on yourself. But can you just share a little bit about the difficulty of your role in dealing with violence prevention and how it's personal for you?
Well, it's very personal for me. The truth is, Andre, the reason why I decided as a very young child that I wanted to be the mayor of Baltimore is the first time I saw someone get shot. That happened before I was even 9 years old. And no one really cared, right? Like city government didn't rush to my neighborhood. When I was, my friends and I were just expected to go to school the next day, like nothing happened. Like we were just suspected that we lived in Park Heights and that's the way that life happened. But it's different when you've been the person that had to duck the bullets. It's different when you've been a elected official and been testifying, ironically, in Annapolis in the State House for a bill around a public safety agency, only to get a text message at that time that one of your close friends' little brother is gone, right? It's different when you've lost people. It's different when someone who was like a brother to me, literally the biggest champion of our Safe Streets violence intervention work, Dante Barksdale, was murdered, right? Doing his job. That makes it very personal for me. But when times get tough, I hear his voice telling me to keep going. I think about those folks who lives that we have saved. And it's ironic. I was talking to the athletic director of my high school yesterday. He says, how do you stay the way you are? I said, look, coach, it's no different than when we win. I stay middle. Don't get high at the high. You don't get low at the low, because the focus is making sure that you win every day, that you get better every day, that mistakes are going to happen, that things are going to happen. But that is really a reaffirmation of why you do the work. But when it's different when people can come to you. And for me, it's different when you have moms say like, hey, my son told me he was going to look for you before the game, before he was shot and killed, right? So you can help him get a job. That makes it very personal. But it also just, for me, makes me be even more dedicated to the work and allows me really to ground myself in reminding myself why I'm here and why I stepped up to do this job in the first place.
Chris, I met you in New Orleans, in Louisiana. Eventually, you moved on from more the K-12 space to lead a foundation. Racism is real in Louisiana, and there are assumptions about Black people that often, in many people's mind, are reaffirmed by violence. How do you tell about the stories of people doing what they can with what they have to make a way in the world, and yet you have these incidents of violence? Can you share a little bit about that reality?
Yeah, I mean, you and I both cut our teeth educating students in New Orleans. I eventually spent about a decade here in Baton Rouge working to start new schools and help create new educational opportunities. So, thinking about the development of youth, I was the first in my family to get to go to college. And so those sort of opportunities to change trajectories for families is very personal to me. I think what I try to do in this role is because I've spent so much time all across our community, in schools, in neighborhoods, is there are so many people that often don't traverse to other parts of town, to these neighborhoods that there is an opportunity. And I think one of my biggest jobs is to help people confront that, not just through data, but through For example, we've taken bus tours. We've gone to local churches and met with pastors, had panels where people can talk about what they're experiencing, why they've lost, the economic realities of accessing a job. And a lot of times these are funders. These are people that live in a different side of town, but they're able to confront and see and frankly see the physical environments. So I think that's critical. I think another part is I think it's giving the voice to the people who feel this even more personally. I mean, two of the leaders of our kind of community-wide effort on Safe BR were a grandmother and a father who both lost children to gun violence. One was a 3-year-old and one was a 19-year-old in college, and both of their murders still not been solved. And I think giving them the platform, and one is a white guy and one is a black grandmother, giving them, they've come together as partners to talk about why this is not just a law enforcement issue. It's not just a criminal justice issue. It's about investment, and it's about us rowing together in the same direction. So I think in all this, we find whatever spot we sit in, as the mayor and as Denise said, I mean, it's the fuel of why we're in this work, but we've got to use our platforms to make sure we bring so many others to see the way forward. And we're not going to solve this if we're working in isolation or we're spreading our resources thin. We have got to have a coordinated strategy, like so many other cities have, and that's why we're honored to be working with this team to bring that and work together to bring more opportunity to Baton Rougeans.
Well, we're at time. I'm going to just ask each panelist to close out with maybe 30 seconds of just inspiration, and let's say a partnership that you're working with that is truly inspirational and can serve as a model for other cities. And we'll go from Denise to Chris and end with Mayor Scott.
Awesome. So thank you all for your time. So wrapping up, I'll share that one of the partnerships that I'm really proud of and I hope is replicated and continues is our partnership with Los Angeles County's Office of Violence Prevention. They have not only invested in our organization, but various other communities, and they are not just funders, but they're advocates for the work that we do, partnering with foundations. And we hope that that continues and transitions into advocating for the work at a not just a local level, but with the new administration continuing the success and highlighting CBI work. So definitely a strong partner, and for everyone that we continue this work into the coming years, and it continues to grow. And looking forward to seeing you all in different spaces as well in the future.
Chris?
Thanks for the opportunity. Working with the Common Good Labs team, our local district attorney, and the school system, we put together one of the largest data sets of local data we think in the country. Since 2007, we've been able to track every student that's ever gone through our public school system, and then seen those who've been violence involved. And so we've been able to see the lived experience of where people were getting off track, so we can be much more intentional about our investments early to keep our students on that path to success. So that is something unique and novel to bring big institutions like that usually aren't talking into this space. And so that's been the power of these partnerships. And we're excited, again, to be much more intentional and purposeful about how we invest these resources to keep our students on the success track.
Close us out, Mayor Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me. For me, I just want to give a big shout out to everyone in the Baltimore Comprehensive Violence Reduction Plan strategy. All of our community organizations, all of our health-based partners, our law enforcement-based partners, because much like the pillow behind you, Andre would say, much like the Wu-Tang Clan, communities are forever, and people sitting in elected offices are not.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Hanna Love, Rohit, Rhett, for a wonderful report. Make sure you get why did U.S. homicide spike in 2020? And also make sure you pre-order Black Power Scorecard by yours truly. And I wanted to thank all of the production team that brought this together and all of the audience members for joining us. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.